openly to my
Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho. Joining me on set is Shaka Sal himself, aka the Kabale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
How are you?
You look exquisite.
Well, I'm looking up to you, my friend.
Really?
Yes.
Well, you seem to be doing very well.
Well, I'm learning from the best, right?
No, you probably, in fact, become much better because all you have to do, you know what? Is sit on my shoulders or stand on my shoulders. And once you are able to accomplish that, you know what? You will see much, much farther than I.
Well said, well said. A warm welcome to you all our Facebook followers watching us live. Shaka Extra Time is a place where you talk to Shaka himself. And today we'll be talking about a wider range of issues. But I guess let's start in the southern part of Africa where they are reeling from the cyclone Idai that devastated the place, especially in Mozambique, the port city of Beira. Zimbabwe and Malawi. Shaka, your assessment so far?
It looks really so bad. It looks so bad. But the good thing, frankly, is that the international community at least seems to be making a difference. We're talking about the Red Cross, Red Crescent. We're talking about the United Nations, agencies and what have you. They seem to have stepped in, and probably they could actually make a difference. And I think that the governments also seem to be cooperating, but the governments also should, really be able to, for example, deploy their military and all that kind of stuff so that they can actually go and, rescue people, assure people, provide some service deliveries and all that kind of stuff. And we know that there are now a lot of diseases, in fact, that, have sort of surfaced. We're talking about some airborne diseases.
Like cholera.
We're talking about cholera. Malaria is also reported, in fact, to be pretty much around. So the international community needs really to come out very, very aggressively.
The death toll from the entire, I think the entire region so far, they're talking about over 750 people have died as a result. Hundreds of thousands are displaced. And the whole thing, you're talking about maybe close to 2 million people affected by this cyclone.
That's huge. As a matter of fact, when you look at the number of people who are actually being said to be affected, they seem to be much larger than the population of Luxembourg in the center of Europe.
Earlier you talked about the governments, the local governments, they are taking responsibility for some of what's going on. And we've seen them in action. Could this be like something that other countries can draw from?
Well, it's not only that something other countries could draw from, but Paul, I am seeing a lot of criticism, in fact. Some criticism perhaps might be a fair statement, that some of these governments seem to be behaving in a manner that has variously been characterized as actually being socially insensitive. In fact, socially, culturally, politically insensitive to their own people. They need to get out and figure out a way of making sure that they hold each other's back. After all, if you're a government, honestly, what is the justification for you being in power? You have to be in charge of the store. You have to be there for those people that are needing help. You have to provide service delivery. You have to be, in a sense, you have to provide the kind of fundamental security that is required of any society. And first and foremost, the reason why countries have governments is precisely because that particular institution is expected to provide security, is expected to reassure people, to protect people, and is expected to, in a sense, to be there when people need it. We're talking, in fact, about the cyclone. We also can talk about, for example, like drought in Kenya, especially in Turkana country. And I'm sure that if it's Turkana country, it probably also means that you're talking about the Karamojong in Uganda, the north, eastern part of Uganda. I'm sure is also being affected. And I'm seeing some of the reports coming out of Kenya. It doesn't look good because the government, frankly, doesn't seem to have stepped up. It needs to really step up. It needs to demonstrate the capacity of providing security. It needs to be seen, not in the manner in which it is being seen right now or being perceived as an institution, frankly, that is sort of faceless, a sort of capitalism that Tanzania's founding president, Mwalimu Kambarage Julius Nyerere, used to talk about a capitalism with no human face. We do know that there is some reasonably good capitalism in Kenya, but it should have a sort of face. It should step up and make sure that it is not seen to be behaving in a manner that is socially, is culturally, is economically, is politically insensitive to its people. I am told, for example, that when people come from the areas or the neighborhoods of the Turkana part of Kenya, sometimes, in fact, when they are going to Nairobi and what have you, they actually say that they are actually going to Kenya, meaning that they actually feel very peripheral. They don't feel like they are part of what is going on. I think that the government should step up to the plate, provide the fundamentals. We're talking about water here. And you're talking about societies that basically live or pretty much,
they are nomads.
They are nomads. They are pastoralists. They live off the cows, sheep, goats, and stuff like that. And when there is no water, and what have you,
That's
can imagine
the livelihood. Yeah. Let me push back a little bit. Let's go back to the cyclone in Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Malawi. Shaka, these are natural disasters. I don't know what the government could have done to prevent something like this.
You asked that question last time. You keep asking that question, and I really don't know why. Because let's face it, there is such a thing as the early warning system. This is not the first time these things are happening, Paul. These things have happened several times before. As a matter of fact, I recall in the 2000s, there was simply too much cyclone, too much flooding in a country called Mozambique. The last time I checked, if it wasn't for South Africa providing its air force, its military, and what have you, to provide help on the international community, we probably would not have a country today known as Mozambique.
Could it be perhaps because most of the country is in the lowlands?
Sometimes, of course, there are problems in lowlands, so those people need some kind of warning so that, when that event is about to happen, they can relocate from those areas and go to safer areas. And then governments also, frankly, need to be in a position where they can provide some fundamentals. We're talking about water, H2O. I was not a particularly good student in science, but I know that water is pretty much equivalent to H2O. You need
Chemistry,
water.
101, eh?
Yeah, there are basically three things that a human being needs in order to be a human being, Paul. The last time I checked, you need water when you are thirsty. You need food when you're hungry. And you need oxygen, my friend, in order to breathe.
Somebody is asking about the nomadic tribes that you talked about. Let's go to Nambililwa, Mona Amna. Governments have totally forgotten about the nomadic societies in the Rift Valley regions. So going back to the point you made earlier, in this particular case, governments really are limited because how do you even control people who are constantly moving? How do you address their challenges?
No, you're right. You raise a very, very, very important issue, Paul. But let's face it, the circumstances might be difficult. The question is, is it impossible? No, it is doable. For example, they should have water storages, really. They should have food security ready to step in just in case these circumstances, kind of like, provide their ugly side. And you have a military. You have a military, for example, which could actually be mobilized and be deployed in order to make a difference in those particular areas.
But speaking of the military, if you're dealing with nomadic situations, people who are pastoralists, in most cases those guys have guns. If you bring in the military, that's like almost a war, going to war with these guys.
It depends how you go about these things. By the way,
they tried it in Uganda.
Paul,
they tried to disarm the Karamojong in Uganda, and
yes, but again, it depends. If somebody is hungry and you are bringing food, if somebody is thirsty and you're bringing water, I don't think this person, frankly, has any interest in preventing you to do it, because it is in that individual's best interest to have unfettered access to the things that make it possible for that particular individual to survive. And then again, when you talk about the pastoralists and what have you, these people, first of all, they are very, very smart. They are very, very brave. They are very, very flexible, because they are the type of people who do not live in one particular place. They normally move following water, following grass, and what have you. And so they are people who are in a position, if they see help coming and what have you, they recognize it, and I'm sure they respect it.
Speaking about survival, let's talk about young educated Africans who are also looking for survival. They are fleeing their countries despite the fact that a lot of African economies have had, over the last 2 decades, have been having some significant gains. And we are talking about a report released today by Afrobarometer, a non-partisan African research network that really looks at about 35 countries, released a report saying that a lot of young people are fleeing the continent looking for greener pastures outside of the continent, especially going to Europe, coming to North America. Your thoughts on that?
It is very unfortunate, because part of the reasons, of course, is that you have to look at what is called forces that push and forces that pull. When you talk about young people trying to access Europe for greener pastures and what have you, and some of them, in fact, doing the dying in the Mediterranean Sea, it is because somehow there is what people have been talking about, the leadership deficit as far as the continent is concerned. Mind you, a lot of people may not know, both in Africa and outside Africa, that Africans are not poor because Africa is poor. On the contrary, Africa is perhaps, arguably, one of the richest continents on this planet Earth. As a matter of fact, this is again where I sometimes agree with Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni, because I have heard him say in one of my earlier interviews about how Africa does probably not need aid, because in fact it is the continent that provides the aid for the most part to Europe. And you can see it reflected in terms of, for example, minerals. You're talking about copper, cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo, from Zambia, and from other places. These are some of the countries providing those types of resources in tandem with those other countries which are providing oil, for example, like Nigeria, like Angola, like Gabon, like several other countries that have helped a country like China, for example, to actually become the second most important country economically in the world in no time, because China does not have those types of resources. And yet, China is now becoming a superpower. Guess what? At the expense of Africa. So where is the African leadership really to harness the kind of resources that it has for the benefit of its people? I think part of the problem is that we have a continent, for example, in terms of land, in terms of fertility, in terms of how the land, for example, is so arable to the extent that, in fact, it could be converted into a sort of bread basket. I went to school at UCLA, the University of California, Los Angeles, and I used to drive by San Joaquin Valley. San Joaquin Valley is a food basket in California, not only for California, but probably for the world. We used to study about that particular place when we were studying geography in high school and what have you when I was in Uganda. But when you look at San Joaquin Valley, you see a lot of sand around there. So you can imagine what technology has done in terms of recovering the arable part of the land, that it has actually been transformed into a bread basket of sorts. And so I think Africa does a problem on not having leaders really that could step up to the plate, mobilize, organize, harness resources, and make sure that these resources benefit, for the most part, the people of Africa. That's the reason why young people are running away from Africa. They shouldn't be running away.
Speaking about Africa, somebody is calling you out here. He says that you don't have a moral authority to speak about African issues. Let's go to Jonah Gasana Jr. from Uganda. Wonders why, Shaka, you live in the United States of America. He says you have no impact on African politics. Why should anybody ask you anything about Africa? Why can't you focus on American politics rather than African politics?
You know, it is very interesting that Mr. Gasanani is saying what you just said, because in fact, if I did not have an impact, to be very honest with you, he probably wouldn't have wasted his time, his valuable time, taken advantage of the fact that we are now on Shaka Extra Time, so that he is able to ask that particular question. And I think that he asked the question precisely because I have an impact. And I have to have a moral obligation, in fact, have an inalienable right, a birthright, to be concerned, to worry, and to think about what happens to Africa, because what happens to Africa happens to Shaka Sali and other millions and perhaps a billion people on the African continent. I am a kid who was born from a place called Kabale, southwestern Uganda. I am from Africa. I am an African, no matter, in fact, where I live. And by the way, the responsibility even for being concerned about Africa should not be limited simply to people who live on the African continent or people who were born there. Because I remember a great American, a man who sometimes is referred to as the American conscience, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., at one time talked about how injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. When you are talking about justice and injustice and what have you, you are not talking about ghettos here, slums and what have you. You cannot ghettoize injustice. You cannot put injustice in slum. That is a universal value. Everybody is affected. The world is connected. And by the way, the last time I checked, most of Africa, if not all, most of Africa, with the exception perhaps of Ethiopia, was actually colonized by European powers. And guess where, in fact, the movement for the decolonization of Africa began? It did not necessarily begin on the African continent by people like Gasanani. It actually began among the people who were Africans but in the diaspora. You're talking about a man called Marcus Garvey from Jamaica. but actually who made his name fighting against racism and social political injustice in Harlem, up Manhattan.
George Padmore.
George Padmore, another man from the island, William Sylvester Williams, I'm told. And then you're talking about Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, a man who got a PhD in sociology from Harvard, by the way, in 18-something. Can you imagine somebody getting a PhD at that
I
time?
visited the Du Bois Center in Accra.
Yeah,
you
Ghana.
did? Yes.
Yeah, you saw where they buried him and his wife.
Right.
And this was a man, in fact, including, you can also talk about people like Paul Robeson, who was a legally trained mind. He had a degree from Columbia University in law. He was a great American footballer from Rutgers University in New Jersey. He was a great actor, but he couldn't practice his craft in the time of Jim Crow in the United States. He ended up in the United Kingdom. And guess what? He ended up hanging out with people like Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria, the man who became Nigeria's first president, and a man who was arguably one of the first few people to get PhDs from Nigeria and from Africa for that matter. People like the Osajefo, the Redeemer, the kid from Nkroful, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, people like the great Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya. Those were some of the people that these guys actually became mentors and said, you know what, you need to be decolonized. You need to have freedom to be in charge of your affairs. So when he talks about freedom, you do not worry about where the message is coming from. I am definitely concerned about Africa, not only because I'm an African, but because I am a human being. There was a French philosopher who was called Descartes, who actually said, I think, therefore I am. And that was part of the reason why slavery, in fact, was ended. Because Africans finally were seen to be human beings.
Let's move along,
like
Shaka. Let's move along.
That young person, whoever it is, he should know that when we talk about things that are happening in Africa and are not so good, it's not because we hate Africa. No. It's because we love Africa and we love ourselves. And I'm talking about humanity.
Let's go to another comment. Kingdom Theodore. Do you think Africans hate themselves because leaders have made them think that they hate themselves?
I don't think that Africans really hate themselves. It is simply that either they do not have the kind of tools that they really need to have and must have in order to walk their way to the club of freedom. Because at the end of the day, Africa is endowed with almost everything you can think about. To tell you the truth, Paul, there is no need why an African kid should not have a guarantee of 3 meals a day. There is no need why Africa should be crying for things that are surely abundant almost everywhere. I think what Africa needs is good leadership. It needs leadership that is made up of men and women with character, with integrity. It's not just about degrees. It's not just about being generals with ranks on your shoulders and what have you, and you are able to buy and drive a tank. It's not about having an air force and you fly it and what have you. It's about having the ability, having the sense of organization, mobilizing and organizing, and frankly, making sure that you are patriotic to your community, your society, not necessarily patriotic to your stomach, because we need each other. And when you think about it, when you look at traditional Africa is a very very good culture, very good society, with great values. In fact, when you talk about Africa, you're talking about extended relationships.
Okay, let's move along. Let's move along. Let's go to Charles Samuni Kambambe. Do you see the current political leadership in Africa having a desire to unite as one?
Well, in fact, you know, it seems to me that the founders, at least, or the people that were very much interested in that kind of idea, that kind of society, it looks like they pretty much lived at a time when, unfortunately, at that time they did not have the opportunity to do it. But if you know, when you think about people like Kwame Nkrumah, for example, when you think about people like Sekou Touré of Guinea-Conakry, you think about Kano Gamara Abdel of Egypt, you think about Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere of Tanzania, you think about my friend, the Zambian founding president, Dr. Kenneth David Kaunda. These were people...
How about Milton Obote of Uganda?
People like Milton Obote. There's no question about it. You can't deny him that credit. Those, especially Milton Obote I, the one that became Prime Minister of Uganda on October 9th, 1962, at least up to 1971, when he was overthrown by Major General Idi Amin Dada. He had a great dream, and he was a man that was very Pan-Africanist. There's no question you could deny him that. These were people who did not have boundaries, nor did they have borders in their minds. What they thought about was Africa. It was a successful Africa. It was an Africa that would accommodate all Africans. And it was an Africa filled with hope. But then there were things that happened and what have you, and since then we have really had an absence of that type of leadership.
Okay, you have a compliment from Madiru Baluku. You have Africa at heart. What are you talking about tomorrow in less than a minute?
What are we talking about tomorrow?
Yes.
Tomorrow, my friend, you know what we are talking about, don't you?
I mean, we have like 30 seconds.
Huh?
What are you talking about on Straight Talk tomorrow?
Tomorrow we are looking at the cyclone, the effects of the cyclone, and things like drought and what have you, and how, for example, the international community can and in fact could come about and help the Africans to conquer those problems.
Do you think so far, as what we have seen, the international community is doing its part as far as giving aid and maybe reaching out to the people in need?
I think that it is trying, at least so far, but I think it could do much better.
Yeah, interesting. You have a couple comments, but I don't think we have time to get to those comments. Any you like to say, keep hope alive? What should Africans look forward to?
I think, first of all, of course, Africans should not get bitter because they can get better. And let us keep the African hope alive. Because you know what? The alternative, we cannot afford. It is 6 feet deep.
Interesting. On that note, I thank you so much for being a great guest. I look forward to hosting you on another edition of Shaka Extra Time. Until then, so long from Washington. Thank you, sir.
You're most welcome.